This video is for Unit 1.5 on the nitrogen cycle. First thing we're going to do is take a look at your data from the nitrate in the soil investigation that you already did in class. So looking at this data, we can see that there are some interesting things that stand out. First of all, we see that we've got field 2 with quite a bit amount of nitrate in it, an average of 77.3 milligrams per liter. And then our lowest was lawn 2 at an average of 0.5 milligrams per liter. From there, the next highest one was the creek at 21 milligrams per liter on average. And then the rest of them fall in that roughly 6 to 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate average. So these are the three that kind of stand out to us. So if we were to rank these from the amount of nitrate that's in them, we start with the least amount of nitrate being lawn 2, the very highest amount of nitrate being the field, and then the creek somewhere in the middle. So thinking about that data and what we've actually seen with the data and the trends in the data already, we're going to move forward and look at the nitrogen cycle itself and how the way that nitrogen moves through the air and the soil and the water and plants and animals maybe relates to this data in some sort of way. So the first thing we have to start with any cycle, as in the carbon and the oxygen cycle, is where's our largest reservoir or our largest place where we find the most nitrogen. And in this case, much like the carbon-oxygen cycle, we find a lot of our nitrogen in the air, okay, in the atmosphere. So that's where we're going to start. About 70% of the atmosphere is actually nitrogen in the form of nitrogen gas. Now that nitrogen gas we can breathe into our bodies, but we can't keep it there. We breathe it back out, so it doesn't do us any good in the atmosphere. But somehow we have to get that nitrogen into our bodies. Nitrogen is the basis for a lot of the proteins that we use to make muscle and other cell structures. It's also found in DNA. So the question is, or the problem is, how do we get that nitrogen gas into our bodies so we can use it? Well, the first step starts by the help of some plants. So I'm going to draw some soil down here, and we'll draw a little plant and its roots. And we're going to show the nitrogen gas being taken up by that plant. And what it's actually going to is not the plant itself, but down here on the roots. On the roots of that plant, we've got tiny little bacteria. And these little bacteria are called rhizomes. You don't have to know that. But they live on the roots of plants. And what they can do is they can take that nitrogen that's in the air, that nitrogen gas, and change it into something called nitrate, which is NO3. So it's actually those bacteria on the roots of plants that do that. The special plants that have these bacteria on their roots are called legumes. An example of a legume is a soybean plant, but there are others. Alfalfa is a legume, peas are legumes. There are certain types of trees, like an alder, for example, that's a legume. And now this nitrate can then be used by plants, so the plants soak it back up, put it into their tissues, and then have nitrogen in their tissues, because they also need nitrogen in order to build their tissues, just like we do. Now, the next step to get it into animals, if we make a human, obviously we can eat the nitrogen that's in the plants, or we can eat an animal that's eaten the plant, for example, a cow, that has nitrogen in it. So that's how the nitrogen gets to us, is through eating stuff that has nitrogen in it. But it all has to start with the nitrogen coming from the atmosphere and using those bacteria on the roots of plants to put that nitrogen into the soil, which the plants can then use. Now that'd be nice if this was all there was to the nitrogen cycle, but we haven't made a cycle yet. Somehow that nitrogen has to get back to the atmosphere. So when humans die, or plants die, they can put the nitrogen back into the environment. So humans and plants put nitrogen back in the environment in a form called ammonia. Ammonia, as you can see, is NH3. So when they die, I'll just put die, and they decompose. So decompose. Plant and animal tissue breaks down into ammonia. That ammonia can also be made into NO3 or nitrate. Better label this over here so you don't forget what that is. Nitrate. So this ammonia can be turned into nitrate, which remember can be used by plants again. So that's great. There's another type of bacteria that does that. Sometimes when that ammonia is turned into nitrate, and I'm just going to write it over here because we're running out of room, that nitrate doesn't get used up by plants. Instead, it gets turned back into nitrogen gas in the environment. And that process we call denitrification. So that completes our cycle loop. So we took that nitrogen out of the atmosphere, we got it into plants and animals die and decompose, that nitrate is eventually turned back into nitrogen gas. Again, this happens with the help of bacteria. And the nitrogen gas goes back into the atmosphere. Now, a couple more things I want to point out. This process right here, over here by the plant, where the bacteria on the roots of the plant bring nitrogen into the soil, that has a name that we need to use, and it's called nitrogen fixation. So again, nitrogen from the air going into the soil using bacteria on the roots of legumes is called nitrogen fixation. So let's go back and look at all the different places where the bacteria were important in this cycle. So the first thing the bacteria did is the nitrogen fixation. Okay, so number one is right here, nitrogen fixation. Bacteria changed the nitrogen gas into nitrate. Number two, right here, the bacteria changed the ammonia into nitrate. So that could be used by plants as well. You see farmers spraying ammonia on their fields, for example, as fertilizer. It isn't used as fertilizer by plants until the bacteria change it into nitrate. And then the third way that bacteria can be involved in the nitrogen cycle is right there where they change the nitrate into nitrogen gas. Now let's take one more look at the results of our lab and think about why might there be higher nitrate in a field or a creek than there is in a lawn. So remember what our particularly high nitrate levels were found, or where our particularly high nitrate levels are found. We had field 2, and we had creek 1. So the question is that you're going to be writing about in your conclusion is, why did these two have such high levels? Which of those processes that I just talked about in the nitrogen cycle that put nitrogen in the soil could have actually increased the amount of nitrogen in the field and the creek? So remember, there are different ways nitrogen can get into the soil, through nitrogen fixation, through decomposition, through fertilizer that people add to fields or lawns or parks or anything that might be needing that fertilizer. And then the other question is, why was the lawn so low in nitrogen? Think about things that make nitrogen lower. What uses nitrogen? What takes nitrogen out of the soil? Well, plants do, right? Plants will take nitrate out of the soil, and also denitrifying bacteria will take nitrogen out of the soil and return it to the air. So that may have something to do with lawn too. So I want you to consider that as you're writing your conclusion for this lab. Don't forget to fill out the form that goes with this video as well before coming to class.